might be a good time just to put up, just so everyone knows, I did send Pam just a couple slides just to go over some quick sort of definitional issues, just so that uh, there was a chance to sort of go over some of the terminology and make sure that we were all more or less sort of on the same page. I think one thing that's, I think a lot of folks are sort of familiar with conversion therapy. Thank you all for joining us tonight. This is sometimes referred to as reparative therapy, and of course is a deeply harmful and scientifically discredited form of treatment, which does attempt to change someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. This can involve a range of harmful practices, everything from talk therapy, conversion therapy camps or group counseling that may involve pseudoscientific or clinical approaches that are aimed at linking queer and trans identities to things or just sort of treating them as fundamentally unhealthy or ungodly or unchristian or even evil, and depending on who you might be sort of receiving this conversion therapy from. It can also look like barriers and obstruction to things like gender affirming care, which I think is really important to think about in the context of trans conversion practices. So that's conversion therapy. SOGIECE, sort of as opposed to conversion therapy, SOGIECE kind of refers to a broader set of behavioral, clinical, cultural, and or faith-based practices, which include, but are not necessarily limited to conversion therapy practices. So sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression change efforts, that's the full acronym, is sort of thought of as a broader umbrella term that may also include less formalized or structured attempts to change someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, and or gender expression. And then like I was mentioning earlier, it is, I think, important to sort of think about the diversity of conversion practices and how they might differentiate between different settings, religious versus clinical versus social, as well as what the specific target of that conversion practice is all about. So whether that's sort of focused on someone's queer sexual orientation versus their gender identity or gender expression, or sometimes both. But it's just, I guess, more important to recognize that it may not look or feel or be experienced in the same way for all survivors. And then I think, are there any questions about that? I think, and thanks for moving on to the next slide, Pam. I think, thinking about the different settings in which conversion practices might be taking place and experienced, it is quite different, in terms of thinking about faith-based or religious environments in which these harmful practices are being enacted upon queer and trans people. But that may actually look quite different from someone whose experience is really rooted in actually a clinical environment where they are trying to seek care and support from the health system. And they're, encountering really unnecessary and quite harmful barriers and obstructions to, for example, trans people who are trying to access gender affirming care, and that may, involve hormones, but also just, not being able to access a healthcare provider who is affirming in their approach, and therefore, creates trauma, may sort of practically look like a refusal of service, um, uh, where these folks may actually be misgendered, or told that, what they're experiencing isn't gender dysphoria, and the ways in which they need to be sort of managing this are sort of rooted in really harmful ideas and practices that are sort of linking queer and trans identities to something that's just not real. And then social environments, I think, can also be a really important site in which SOGIECE is actually taking place, where family members, friends, or others in people's social environments may actually be perpetuating harmful, invalidating ideas about queer and trans people. So I hope that that's helpful in terms of covering some of the terminology, SOGIECE versus conversion therapy practices. For folks sort of wondering what's on this slide, this just sort of provides a bit of a breakdown of some of the research that the Community-Based Research Center has been involved in, which has actually been quite pivotal in the overall advocacy effort in Canada, and the effort to specifically get the federal conversion therapy ban in place earlier this year. So Pam, you can take down the slide because I actually would love to just step back a little bit and answer the question that you had posed, which is just to give a little bit of a personal history for myself in terms of how I got involved in this work. So I came out in 2003. I had just turned 19, and I had grown up in a really conservative family. First, a very ethnocentric church, and then I sort of moved on to a Pentecostal church, whereby sort of the feelings of the fact that I was gay, but that it was wrong, and that I was damned to go to hell. All of this was sort of mounting in my early 20s. And I came out in 2003 after a year of just, being so exhausted and just fed up with being depressed, but being in an environment that just where I just couldn't feel accepted, and the result was a lot worse than I actually expected. I sort of knew it was going to be hard, but it actually ended up being a lot worse than what I had expected. My family actually referred me to an ex-gay Christian therapist for regular phone counseling sessions, where I was asked to recount all of my recent homosexual thoughts and actions, and discussing scripture, and then of course always ending in prayer. That actually, I only sort of lasted a few months of that, because the experience was just so painful and horrifying, and I think more than anything else, just a sense of being distraught that my family was forcing me to attend these sessions. And the challenges only sort of grew from that point. I had attempted suicide. I was linked with a really unsupportive psychiatrist, and I had a really tough year sort of after coming out. Luckily, I just by dumb luck, in some ways it feels, I I got connected, I learned about this opportunity to work in gay men's health on a young gay men's health sexual leadership program called Tolia right in Vancouver. And it was through this experience that connected me with CBRC. And from that point, sort of got involved in HIV and sexual health promotion. And but even at that point, I still didn't feel comfortable identifying as a survivor. It was really challenging to talk about my experience. I just felt so ashamed having gone through that. And I was literally afraid that, despite working in a much more supportive and affirming environment where, my queerness was actually celebrated, I still felt so much shame and trauma from what had happened that I wasn't actually able to talk about it. It's actually only been in the last few years that I've been able to locate myself in this work. And so I'll sort of fast forward to 2019 when a really close friend and colleague of mine, Travis Salway at Simon Fraser University, he had approached me with this idea of trying to organize a panel on sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts at our annual conference. It's the summit that we organize in the fall each year. And this was kind of our first foray into even just talking about conversion therapy as an organization. And we weren't quite sure what was going to happen, but we had pulled together a really amazing panel that included survivors, researchers, policy advocates, folks like Nick Schiavo at No Conversion Canada. And it was a fantastic panel. And Travis also organized this one-day symposium bringing together a lot of amazing folks that are sort of connected to different communities and sectors, researchers, faith-based leaders, and community organizations, and CBRC as sort of like a host for that. So that sort of was the beginning of a process of trying to dig in further around the research and better understand, where we were at, like what was the extent of the problem in Canada. And in our 2020 Sex Now survey, and that this is where I'll sort of refer to some of the findings that were included on that slide. We found some pretty striking results. What we found included the first ever sort of estimate of the prevalence of conversion therapy practices in Canada. We found that 10% of our participants, and there were many thousands of folks who participated in the survey, 10% of those participants reported having experienced conversion therapy over their lifetime. And we also found that some really insightful data on various settings of conversion practices. So 67% of the folks who reported having experienced conversion therapy, 2/3 of them reported experiencing it within a religious or faith-based setting. So, quite definitely the majority. But 30% had also reported experiencing it within a licensed healthcare provider office. We also found that there were disproportionate impacts. So whereas the overall prevalence was 1 in 10, we found that 1 in 5 of non-binary and trans participants in the survey had experienced conversion practices. 15% of people were reporting immigrant or newcomer experience, and 13% of youth age 15 to 19. I think, just the point about that statistic, I think it's really important to highlight that because it does reflect that this is not a thing of the past. This is, this is a 2020 survey when we were collecting this data, and youth as young as 15, that's sort of the minimum age to participate in the survey. 13% of youth in the 15 to 19 age bracket reported having experiences. So I think, what that says is that this is very much an ongoing present problem that we are still actively dealing with in our communities, that there are vulnerable trans and queer folks who are still subjected to these extremely harmful practices. And then of course, also racialized folks. I think the conversations around who conversion therapy is impacting is often centering the experiences of non-racialized folks. And I think what we're starting to learn is that racialized 2S LGBTQI plus people in Canada are also experiencing this, but it's not as well captured. They may be experiencing these things abroad, and coming to Canada with these really traumatic memories and experiences, and represent another important group that may be in need of more support. So I've taken up a ton of time here. I had a lot of stuff that I wanted to cover, but I do want to make sure that my co-panelists have some opportunity to chime in.
Thank you so much, Michael. And actually, that was the definitions and the difference between conversion therapy practices and SOGIECE was really helpful for me, actually. So I really appreciate that, and I can use them in a more informed way. And it's a tragedy, but I think none of us are really surprised that 67% of folks have experienced this in religious settings. So yeah, that's why we wanted to stop. So next, I'll invite Jordan to answer our first question here.
Thanks, Pam. And thanks for the invitation to join with you tonight. It's great to reconnect with some of the United Church faces that I know and love from my previous job. So I just want to begin by acknowledging all the survivors who have been so bold and so courageous in the last number of years to fight for laws to ban conversion therapy practices in Canada. I'm in awe of their courage, of their courage to be out there in the public eye, and I'm really grateful for their activism and for their presence publicly. Between 2018 and 2020, when I was working for the United Church of Canada at the General Counsel Office as LGBTQ justice staff, I drafted the United Church's statement against conversion therapy, the letter to the Prime Minister in support of an earlier rendition of the bill, and the Church's Take Action resources, encouraging members to write to local MPs in support of the ban. But I was always aware that my advocacy efforts were being done at a real distance. And they were public, maybe in the United Church community, but not outside of that community. And they were done from the national office, which really distances me from what the experiences of so many other survivors who were public in the media and in their local communities. So I really respect all those who engaged in this work leading up to the federal ban. I was not one of those folks who did that courageously. I'm just beginning to find my courage and my voice in this area. In early 2021, I was asked to coordinate the SOGIECE CT Survivor Support Project, and I was a little hesitant because it was very clearly announced as a project that was to be led by survivors, with survivors, for survivors, and I just was second guessing myself. Did I, was I a survivor? I mean, my experience wasn't as bad as some of the other folks' experiences I'd heard. So I was actually doing what a lot of people, a lot of participants of our study, the research study actually did, comparing my experience to others and questioning the validity of my own experience. In reality, I'd spent 27 years internalizing conversion therapy practices through prayer, the study of religious texts, disassociation from my body, and suppression and denial of my sexual and gender identities. I spent 6 years in counseling with a Christian counselor and change attempts where conversion therapy practices were used. I came out as a lesbian at age 33 and as a trans man at age 51. I am now 62 and queerly heterosexual, but I spent decades of my life hiding in shame and fear and struggled with suicidal ideation until my mid-30s. So yes, I am a survivor of conversion therapy practices in religious settings. I am a survivor of SOGIECE. So the SOGIECE CT Survivors Support Project was conducted from April to September last year. We included a survey, focus groups, and interviews, and we heard from about 270 survivors. The main research questions focused on what have you found helpful in recovering from your experience of harm, what barriers or challenges have you experienced, and if resources were unlimited, what supports would you like to see made accessible to survivors in Canada? So the project's purpose was not to learn about the experience of conversion therapy, but to assess what supports are needed by survivors today in Canada. You can read the report, which shares findings from the project at CBRC website, and I will put that in the chat. Where's the chat? There we go. If you want to look that up. So just briefly, today, what my work entails at the Community-Based Research Center is to work with colleagues, survivors, and key stakeholders across Canada to create supports for survivors, to create resources to educate a wide variety of people and organizations about what SOGIECE or conversion therapy practices are, and to improve understanding of the federal ban, which we're all just beginning to figure out, very early stages of that one, and to collaborate across sectors to prevent conversion therapy practices from continuing to harm people. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Jessica, over to you.
Perfect, thank you. Well, it is absolutely an honor to be here. I will take a moment to kind of situate where I kind of fit into this conversation, because it's quite a limited piece, but I'm just in awe already of what I've heard, and I had limited understanding of sort of the work that was going on before the ban came into effect. So I am a staff lawyer at CPLE, which means that we make the law understandable for Albertans in a variety of ways through info sheets, videos, webinars, web content, etc. And so my work kind of comes in after the ban came into effect, and so it's been really interesting to just hear some of what went on long before we even got to where we are today. So that's kind of my situating myself in this conversation, is really looking at the legal perspective and the actual, what is the legal text around the ban. And then our job at CPLE is to, like I said, make that understandable. So really just, bringing awareness to the laws now around conversion therapy. And I can speak a little bit more about that later on, but yes, that's me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is, I'm learning a lot too. And unfortunately, there's always more to learn. But I think, Jordan, what you said in terms of, sort of coming out as a survivor, I think it's really important because it emphasizes and reminds us that it doesn't just look one way, right? And I think that the definitions that you shared, Michael, and, what we're going to get into a little bit more, help us understand how to recognize it for ourselves and for others. And so, I really appreciate the, in-depth details that you're sharing about your experiences, because that helps us have a better context for kind of who this affects and how deep it can go. So we know, and we all rejoice, as we should, that conversion therapy was criminalized on a federal level in January of this year. And while we celebrate that, there's always this kind of voice in the back of my head is like, okay, that's on the books, but what does it look like in real life now? Because I know even in the past, 8 months, I've had people say, well, now like conversion therapy is over, right? So what else are you going to work on? Or, they can't believe if somebody tells them that they're experiencing something that kind of seems like that. And they're like, but it's illegal, right? And so I think that that's our hearts really wishful thinking that this is something that, actually did eradicate all of these things. But I want to ask you all, from your perspective, since that ban came into place, what have you seen change and what haven't you seen change so far? And whoever wants to kind of start on that.
I'm happy to keep the order for now, but we can change that up down the road. I think it's kind of I'd sort of characterize it as a bit of a mixed bag of, changes, or things that have yet to change yet. I think the first thing that I will sort of note, to my knowledge, there has not actually been any charges made as a result of the new law. That may have changed, but the intel that I had received a few months back was that the Department of Justice didn't seem to be aware of any cases where this law was actually being used to and enforced against any particular, conversion practitioner or organization that's sort of known to promote or practice any sort of form of conversion therapy. So I think we have yet to see the other shoe drop in terms of how this law will actually be applied in practice. And Jessica, really love to hear your perspective. Bringing that to legal expertise is something that Jordan and I are really interested in getting sort of more engagement with, just because we're coming at it from more of an advocacy and maybe even more of a programmatic level in terms of how can we support community organizations, the Two-Spirit queer and trans community around what's happening. And so I think, a lot of what we've been hearing since the law has been passed is there are still many gaps in terms of people's awareness and understanding of what conversion therapy may even look like, and how it's practiced, let alone how to actually leverage the new law and the new criminal offenses that are connected to Bill C-4, how they are meant to actually be used in practice. I think there are still concerns in terms of how do we support people who might be experiencing conversion therapy actively and are, where there is clear and present sort of danger for them in terms of, the harms that are associated with conversion therapy. How are they, what kind of guidance are we even able to provide people who are in that situation or know or are worried about or concerned about someone they know who may be vulnerable to harm as a result of conversion therapy. And so I think there's a real need to plain language the law and figure out ways in which we can empower people who are vulnerable as well as survivors. I think these are complicated issues because I think at the end of the day a lot of the onus is still on the victim, in order for, this new law to actually be leveraged. But so that's just some thoughts around like, this is, I think, a question that comes up quite a bit, and so I, just wanted to get that out of the way. I think there are some examples of some positive developments as a result of the law, including things like increased government attention on conversion therapy in general. And it's really great to see that now that the law's been passed, there's been some funding been made available to different stakeholders and experts in the community, but also those in the legal education sector, to make sure that we are trying to address those gaps in knowledge and understanding, and to get more information out to more folks, to organizations, to different people who may have an opportunity to intervene and provide support. That may not necessarily involve pressing charges and leveraging the law in the most explicit kind of way that it was meant to be created for, but even to help. I do think that one of the most important aspects of the new law is not about sort of criminalizing potential or actual practitioners. It's actually, more broadly speaking, the symbolic value of the new law, the message that it sends, that trying to change, deny, suppress the identities of queer and trans people is fundamentally wrong. And and I do think that the passage of the law is helping to communicate that, but it's tough because at the same time, like, I don't think we can deny that there is an uptick in anti-trans and queer hate and violence and discrimination. And all of these things are happening at the same time. And so, I think it is important to sort of recognize that we also need to be paying attention to issues like anti-2S LGBTQ+ hate, and to things like barriers to gender affirming care. If trans and gender non-conforming folks aren't able to access the care that they need, that's a form of conversion therapy. If officially criminalizing the practice while access to gender affirming care is restrictive, when queer and trans people are facing violence and discrimination, all of that, I think, at the end of the day, still means that there's quite a bit of work to do, a long way to go in terms of making sure that all queer and trans people can feel included and affirmed within our community. So just some reflections for me.
Thank you so much. Jordan or Jessica, whoever wants to jump in. Jordan.
I'll jump in. I'm grateful for the ban, for the new law. I don't think criminalizing something solves the problem. So what I've been most excited about and most grateful for is to see this issue becoming part of public discourse. And that is public discourse within LGBTQ organizations and two-spirit organizations. It's part of the conversation there. It's happening within religious communities. It's happening within the medical community, within mental health community, and it's happening within LGBTQ people themselves identifying as survivors. So that has been, I think, a real plus to the whole conversation that led up to the law and the need for information sharing since the law has been enacted. I'm also encouraged, like Michael said, that the federal government is putting money behind their banning conversion therapy by providing financial support to a number of organizations across Canada. CBRC is very grateful to have funding for the SOGIECE Survivor Support Project, but also to continue with qualitative research amongst Black, Indigenous people of color, immigrant, newcomer, and refugee to us LGBTQ people's experiences of conversion therapy practices. That's really important. That's happening now. Also, the public legal information and education projects that are happening in many organizations, 2S LGBTQ organizations and legal organizations, with the goal of improving public understanding of conversion therapy practices and the ban. And also excited that we've got continued funding to build an online SOGIECE knowledge hub, which will serve as an exchange of information on SOGIECE, on conversion therapy practices, to strengthen survivor supports, including, we hope to include a referral list of therapists who have experience in working with survivors, and multi-faith spiritual supports. As well as to provide increased knowledge and understanding of SOGIECE and its impact in Canada. One of the things I've seen is like the City Council in Kingston, Ontario, who have provided funding to build survivor supports through creating CT Survivors Connect, which was started by Ben Rogers. And they've also recently committed to an additional funding for over the next 3 years to strengthen the work of CT Survivors Connect. I've learned that one Christian denomination is offering financial assistance for counseling related to harm caused by homophobia and transphobia in their churches. It's not the United Church, and I won't say what church it is because it's being announced only within their community. But that's huge. And if you're with the United Church, tell people that's a good idea. All government bans of conversion therapy practices at whatever level, and all 2S LGBTQ justice work within affirming religious organizations, such as Apologies, need to include financial support for survivor initiatives. So,
thank you so much. Great points.
Okay, I want to piggyback on a few things that were mentioned by Michael and Jordan already. So one of the big things that was already mentioned was the public discourse and some of the funding that's become available, and also making the law plain language. And that's exactly where CPLE fits into this conversation. And that has been our role. So we did receive funding from Justice Canada as well on the public legal education and information side of things to develop a project and a campaign of resources around the ban. And that's what we've done. And so I think at the end, I'll share kind of some of what those resources are. But certainly that's come from it. If this wasn't a law, then CPLE wouldn't have had a role in this conversation. So certainly a big one. And you had also mentioned, Michael, about kind of what the law will do. And I reflecting on that as you were speaking, it's illegal to drink and drive. It's illegal to speed. It's illegal to do a lot of things, and yet it still happens. And so why would we think that just because this is illegal that it wouldn't continue to happen? People break the law all the time. The real question is around enforcement. And I also don't know the stats around whether or not there's been any charges, but I also know that the law is incredibly slow. So when something starts and you have a new law come into place, it can take several years to build up sort of a legal the case law and whatnot around that to actually see how this is moving forward. So some of the big questions still remain. There's a formal definition of conversion therapy in the legislation, and so it defines it quite with some what you might think is quite clearly, but I'm going to suggest there's probably still a lot of gray area there. And so what we probably won't know for a few years, or until more if any cases come out, and how it's going through the justice system, how the courts are also interpreting that. So first you need to have someone who commits the crime, and then it needs to be enforced, and then they need to be charged, and then you need to go through a trial, and then you need to get some case law out of it. Well, that process can take a few years. And so it probably will be years before we even have a body of case law to really understand how this legislation is being enforced. And so really that I appreciate this panel because, I can look at it from the legal perspective and say, okay, the law says this, and it's going to take some time for us to fully understand its implications, but that doesn't take away from, what's actually happening. And this, what's actually, the law is kind of divorced from that in a sense. It doesn't necessarily reflect what's actually happening in the community. And I also want to acknowledge that, the criminal justice system is incredibly an incredibly challenging place for a survivor of any sort of crime. And so, we've seen that come through with other sorts of crimes, especially around sexual violence. And so certainly when it comes to this, that also plays a role in how the law develops, because, it's not a friendly place for a survivor to be, resharing their story and being, and really having to, in some cases, be re-traumatized all over again. And so I think we've seen those stats. I mean, I'm going to use sexual violence because we've done some work around sexual violence laws as well, that the actual reporting versus what's actually happening. So then how do you actually get the the law out of that, and know the instances of it happening in the community? I think there's always a lag and a discrepancy. So yeah, I would say that from us, I mean, we obviously know it's still happening, but I hope that we can play a role moving forward and just continuing to make sure that, among having now this being a public legal education campaign, and not just within certain communities, that we can bring much more awareness to this to everybody, and not just people that are being more affected by it.
Thanks, Jessica. That's really helpful. And I think one of the things that I think is it's kind of hard to hear how the law is a little bit divorced from some actual consequences, because I think for those of us who are or know folks who have gone through this, we want to see justice served, right, in a lot of ways. But I think it's also realistic, and I'm glad to hear all of you articulate it so well, that we just have to understand what this is going to do for us, or might do for us, and what it isn't, so that we can sort of act accordingly, and be thankful for the ways in which I totally agree. I think the public discourse around it, even saying this is happening, has been huge, because I can't even count how many reporters and educators, or people who I would think knew that it was happening, would ask me like, oh, wasn't this in the 80s, right? So I think I feel really thankful for that. But we have some way to go. So this can seem extremely overwhelming, and we might think, okay, I'm one person, maybe I'm part of a faith community or a community organization, and so if we know the law is going to kind of lag a little bit, and there's this kind of middle gray area where there are things that we can do, what are some things in each of your perspectives would you say, would you recommend that we could do in our own communities? Because I think that's actually is where most of the change is going to happen, is us in our own communities making a difference on this, right? And I think that's what I appreciated about so many municipalities banning conversion therapy even before the federal government did, because it sent Michael, you were talking about the symbolism. It sent a message that we don't have that kind of time, right? Because every single person that might or has gone through this matters. So yeah, I guess this is a really big question, but what are a couple of things in your perspective that we could do in our own communities around this?
I think the most important thing is allyship and support for survivors and people who may be vulnerable. I think having access to a supportive person, being able to locate someone where you might be able to find support, someone in the midst, in a seeming sea of rejection and shame and stigma, that there might be someone or some people who might be able to be there for that person. It's just on an individual level, to provide a source of unconditional love and support and affirmation for that person. I think that is so impactful, and I think that's I'm sure Jordan will sort of speak to this more in terms of what we heard from survivors, but even being able to find a single person who can provide that support is so powerful. And that's something that I think we can all do individually, and show up for the queer and trans people that are around us, that may not feel like they have anyone to turn to for support. I think, at a more structural level, it's, recognizing that this isn't over. Just because the new law has passed, it is, something that is a cause for celebration, and something that we should all be trying to build on. But I think one of the dangers with the law being passed is that it creates this false sense of security. I think it's funny that you mentioned the municipal initiatives, Pam, because I think since the federal law has passed, I think we haven't really seen a whole lot of movement in terms of municipal or provincial governments really working to build on the law, right? And I think that that was an important message that sort of got lost in the midst of the celebration, is that there are still gaps. As as expansive as a new law is, there are limits in terms of what changes to the criminal code can do in terms of eradicating this practice. Trans conversion practices, for example, a lot of that is happening within the context of licensed healthcare settings, and we need to engage health professional associations in, and building on the new law by connecting this with regulatory responses to ensure that different health professions are also taking measures to ensure that that trans and queer people's identities are validated and affirmed when they present to them for care, and I think those kinds of aspects to this overall problem need to be addressed.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll jump in. I want to answer that question specifically for faith communities. The responses that I'll give will be applicable to just about any community, but so talk about conversion therapy practices in your community. Talk about what SOGIECE is, the more broader definition of it. Talk about how small, subtle statements to change or deny a person's sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity are just as harmful as the blatant statements or formalized programs and pressures. Talk about sexual orientation and gender identity as core identities. Talk about how Bill C-4 does not infringe upon religious freedom. And talk about what religious freedom actually means, and how religious freedom does not give anyone the right to harm, traumatize, or torture people psychologically and spiritually. Create opportunities for survivors to share their stories, including survivors who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, immigrants, refugees, and newcomers, and believe them. Don't downplay or dismiss their experience. Connection and storytelling is a key part of survivors' recovery. Meeting similar people, hearing their stories, it's pivotal in overcoming internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia that we've absorbed from our religious communities, and dispelling some of the myths that we've heard about LGBTQ two-spirit people. Education and shared stories from survivors of conversion practices hold the potential to prevent future occurrences. People who are questioning and looking for help need access to real stories of people who've experienced SOGIECE and come out the other side, people who know the pitfalls and dangers of these practices and who have recovered from them and are living authentically and joyfully. For me.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And I would add, quickly to that, the first point you made about talking about it is so essential. I think a lot of times we might think or assume that people think if we are an inclusive, progressive, person or faith leader or faith community that, like, of course, of course we don't support this. That's not the assumption that most people would make. So as soon as we have any sort of a religious, something on our business card or something that we're sort of attached to, I've had so many people ask me, what I think about it, and do I think it's okay, right? So I think we need to just assume that because, we're allied with even the most, progressive, loving, social justice minded faith community, that people don't know what we believe until we tell them what we believe. And so I think naming it and then also naming what our stance on it is a really loving act, because then not only do people know that it exists if they didn't, but also anyone with any wondering or question in their mind about, us or the community that we're involved in, it makes a really strong statement. And it also is a loving statement to those who are choosing whether or not to be part of our community, whether they agree with that stance or not. So I think being really public about what you believe is justice, and it helps us get closer to what we want. So thank you for that. And over to you, Jessica.
Again, just from a legal perspective, because that's all I'm really qualified to speak on. I would just say knowledge is power. And so, I wish everyone knew about all the laws that affect their lives, because I think when people know about the laws, it empowers them to make better decisions and whatnot. And so I think, speaking about the ban specifically and the criminal offenses around it, just for that knowledge to be prevalent in our communities and for people to share that. There's something about, I say it's illegal. For some people, that's like a really powerful thing, but I certainly don't want to diminish, and I really appreciate all the conversation really around just the person to person, I think is where that's going to happen though. We're going to do our job as a plea organization to get the word out about the law, but I much appreciate the conversation that that happens between people, and good conversations and just having that people you can trust. So that's all from me.
Thank you. Well, it's not all from you yet, because I do see some more legally minded questions that are awesome in the chat. So Jessica, I would ask you to kind of look at some of those, and I'm going to point a few of them out. One of the things that while you're looking at those, I would want to ask maybe you, Jordan, this question that I got is, notwithstanding that there are, some strong LGBTQ2S individuals, many could be alone, quiet, introverts, and, kind of suffer in silence. And so, there's a question around how and who do we advocate for around them? There are going to be individuals that are more outspoken about their experiences and be able to sort of name what's happening, but a lot of queer folks are also alone, or they don't have community, or they don't have a way to sort of even name what's happening to them or have some support. So how do we sort of advocate with those folks in mind as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it was the most common thing that I experienced in engaging with survivors through the project was that many of them didn't even identify as a survivor until they actually heard about the project and went and looked at the survey and read the questions. And by reading those questions, realized, oh, I am a survivor of this. I have been harmed by this. And that's huge. Because for most of us, and I'm one of them, I didn't even realize until the project, listening to survivors tell their story, I began to realize how harmed I had been by conversion therapy. And I had just walked away from that when I came out, and I'm free now. Everything's good and fine. And but I wasn't addressing the harm done. So what is so important is to hear other people's stories, to find out that, yeah, I had a similar experience. Yes, I was misdiagnosed by a mental health professional as being bipolar, when I've actually been harmed by religious trauma and by conversion therapy practices. And that happens. So need to hear stories. That is just the most important part.
Thank you.
The other thing I want to add, and I just want to add this because I think it's just so important. Conversion therapy practices are happening in United Church of Canada communities of faith. I know that because before I left working for the United Church, I was hearing from people who were experiencing it. I heard from survivors during this project who came from United Church backgrounds who were experiencing conversion therapy practices in their home churches. So it is happening in our churches. Religious organizations have a duty of care to ensure that conversion therapy practices are not happening in their faith communities. And it's just, yeah, there's so much to say. I'll wrap up that for now.
Thanks, Jordan. So Jessica, there's some more legal questions in the chat here. And so I'm just gonna read Chris's here. And Chris says, my lay reading of the lawsuit being brought by former student survivors of Legacy Christian Academy or the Christian Center Academy alleges conversion therapy abuse among other abuses. Does Bill C4 assist plaintiffs bringing lawsuits like this, or bringing lawsuits against institutions like this one? So I'm not sure if you're aware of that particular case and if you wanted to speak to that.
I've seen some of the articles and I haven't dived too much into some of the allegations that are coming out around that institution. But what I can speak more generally to is the, what Bill C4 says and how it works and how it doesn't work. So, and again, this may be very basic for some of you, but I'll try and keep it. I'll try and keep it short. But what Bill C4 does is simply amends the criminal code. So people can be charged under the criminal code with an offense, but charges under the criminal code are seen as offenses against society. So you have the Crown prosecutor prosecuting the accused, and you have actually a victim. Their role is, and I hate to say this, but it is somewhat limited in those proceedings because really the case is between a Crown prosecutor who represents society and the accused who's being charged with this offense or accused of doing this. So those are your parties in a criminal lawsuit. So the short answer to this question is no, because those types of plaintiffs bringing a lawsuit for harm done, that takes place in the civil realm. So in our civil courts, where you can actually have a plaintiff or someone who has been harmed sue someone else for that harm. There has to be it has to be based in a harm that's been recognized in law. So we've seen those cases come about against against religious institutions for abuses. There's a huge history, huge amount of case law about that already, but it's sort of different, and the remedies are different as well. So in the criminal system, you can be fined or it's jail time, whereas in the civil system, it's usually money. And as crass as that sounds, that's usually what it boils down to is a payment of money. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. There's probably like someone trying to deliver something outside our house. So I hope that clarifies kind of those different realms, is that there isn't that same Bill C4 and the change to the criminal code don't introduce those same remedies for the victim themselves, which is why when we've been talking tonight, it's so important to acknowledge the other supports outside of the criminal justice system. And this is I've done some research in the past, and we've created some resources around sexual violence. And so we were looking at that, and I recognize that, just to draw some similarities in terms of the process around that, what people often want to come out of the justice system, and what you really want to be heard, likely, and to feel some sort of justice for what's happened, because it's been this a traumatic experience. But the legal system is limited in what it can offer, unfortunately, and that sucks. And I'll say that quite honestly, but it does. Things like an apology, those aren't things that the legal system is built to give, unfortunately. If, like I said, if you're talking about criminal, it comes down to usually fines or jail time as some sort of recognition of the harm that this person has done against society. And in the civil realm, it's usually coming down to money as an acknowledgement, and that's hard. And it doesn't make it easy for anyone, I don't think, who's gone through that process and who has experienced that harm. So I do want to acknowledge that. I don't think the legal system does acknowledge, it's not built to acknowledge that very well. I might have got off topic there, but I think that hopefully answers the question as well. Oh, I can go to the next part. I was reading the question.
Yeah, sure. I was going to ask you that, so that's perfect.
Yeah. So, a question about the charter challenge. I don't know. Maybe there's, there could be talk. I don't know of any talks. Maybe Michael or Jordan have heard in some of their circles if someone's talking about that. But certainly someone may try to bring that. What I can say about charter challenges, and again, I'm limited on what I can say in terms of making sure I'm not giving any advice too, but when it comes to charter challenges are always a balance, right? So it may be that someone has a right or what we perceive to be competing rights in society. So, one being religious freedoms, but our charter also has this sort of balancing act built in section 1, in that, those are not absolute rights. And so it's not an absolute right to religious freedom. We have this check and balance built in terms of looking at, okay, wait, but if there is sort of an infringement on someone's right, is it okay? Like, is there a really good reason for this infringement to be happening? So I'll make that comment about the charter challenges, because that's often what they boil down to, is if there is an infringement, okay, but is it reasonable and justified in the circumstances?
Thank you for that. And if folks are wondering what the question was that was posed before, because if you're watching the recording, you can't see the chat. Somebody was asking about if we're anticipating a charter challenge to the ban based on religious freedom grounds. And so Jessica was kind of responding to that. And so there's another question around the regulatory response as well, considering that public funds are sent to private institutions. And we are seeing that there are major gaps in how different provinces regulate these institutions. And so Jessica or others, do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess I'll clarify my question in that, because we know there are gaps in how different provinces are regulating those institutions, is that then an advocacy point that an affirming denomination could take on if we were thinking about lobbying our provincial legislatures?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and like general analysis. I mean, I think there are, like I was saying earlier, I think limits to what the criminal code can do, and trying to prevent conversion therapy practices through changes to the criminal code can achieve some things, but there are real parameters to that. And I think there's also, without getting into a super technical conversation about Canadian federalism, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that the other levels of government have an important role to play. They have different policy tools at their disposal that the federal government doesn't have. And, that does include things like clamping down on public funding that's going to organizations, businesses, or institutions that are practicing or promoting conversion therapy. And so, that's, I think, a separate issue and requires additional action and also advocacy to, push policymakers to adopt those kinds of legislative actions that would build on the federal law and add different elements to this policy strategy of addressing conversion therapy practices.
Thanks, Michael. We have Evelyn to ask a question here. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam. Underlying this is the, I'll say, presumption, and please don't allow me to put words in your heads, but the presumption that we have a well-informed society and so on. And I'm of the older profile individual, vastly beyond your senior years, Jordan, and where terminology and infrastructure didn't exist. In any case, today we do have a lot of supports, but one of the things I've seen, unfortunately, too much of, individuals in the community coming out of the closet and facing loss, rejection, hate, and on it goes, And then coupled on top of that now, given the topic tonight, I'll just refer to CTP. And then facing more rejection, more self-doubt, more, well, lots of nasties, retreating perhaps into the closet, or worse, doing self-harm, or having harm committed upon them by so-called do-gooder CTP and others. And I've seen a lot of weaker individuals, if you will, because of the so much, if you will call it self-harm, self-doubt, all the nasties, not having the strength and effectively being prey. And being prey in this world is not a very good place. And I don't think it's fair for us to assume that everybody in the, in quotes, community is aware of the supports. I've heard communication and everything else, but, and you can say, I don't know, it's fine. I just wanted to throw it out there because Jordan, you and Michael at least have, if you will, walked the mile, or at least part of the mile. Jessica, you haven't, but I would welcome your thoughts in that respect. How do we go about reaching those that can't fend for themselves? And there's a lot out there, even now. Sorry, and thank you, Pam.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. Appreciate it.
I would like to respond to that. Yes. The one thing one of the biggest learnings from the SOGIECE Survivor Support Project is that there is a huge lack of supports for survivors. When someone comes out of their faith community, and the vast majority of people who are surviving conversion therapy within religious contexts have to leave their faith community to survive. From then on, there's this huge dearth there's this Grand Canyon absence of supports for survivors, whether it's a place to live, a job, food to eat, education, just the basic necessities of life. But survivors also need help to recognize what kind of harm they've experienced. They need help to overcome the barriers. The barriers in healing from this can seem insurmountable and can be insurmountable for some people. They need safe and affirming and supportive people and spaces, and do not assume for a second because you are an affirming church that you are a safe place. If you are a Christian or any kind of religious community, you are not a safe place for a survivor of conversion therapy practices who experience it in religious settings. We doubt you, we suspect you, we will not trust you, and going to church can be the most traumatic experience. So you need to realize that you need to provide safety in different ways for survivors of conversion therapy practices. They need help to recover from the trauma, and they need people who understand what trauma is, how to recover from it, not just trauma-informed therapy, but trauma recovery therapy. And they need to move from surviving to thriving. So the biggest thing from our project was people don't have supports. We do not have supports in this country for people who are recovering from this. Evelyn, you've talked about all the issues that people face, from shame and anxiety and depression to meeting the basic necessities of life. There's not a lot of supports out there. I mean, the survivors who participated in the project, only 12% of them were able to find a therapist who knew what they were doing when it came to helping someone recover from conversion therapy practices. 12%. Over 80% of participants identified the need for education and awareness. They talked about the need for affirming therapists. An LGBTQ affirming therapist that says, oh, you got out of that. You're not in that faith community anymore. You got out of conversion practice. Oh, good, great. Yes, good for you. And then they think that moving on, we're fine. No, we're not. We need to deal with what's happened. We need to deal with the loss of our community of faith. We need to deal with the loss of our families. There's so much there. We need financial support to access therapy. Mental health is not cheap in this country. And if you do find a good therapist, they cost $120, $150, $160 an hour. People don't have that kind of money. They need subsidized therapy. They need free therapy. And that's another issue in Canada for mental health. It should be a public health issue for Canada. There's just so much, and I get very carried away and upset and passionate about this. But listening to Evelyn, I was just, yeah. I've been aware of people who've experienced this since the 1970s, and I can't believe we still don't have the supports that people need to recover. 50 years later, we're just talking about the issue publicly, let alone having the resources. So resources, we need a lot more.
Thank you, Jordan. We talk about affirming connections, being PI, which is public, intentional, and explicit, right? And so I think all of us in our workplaces, in our, families, in our, all of that, what are ways that each of us in our communities can give symbols and signs and, that we are a safe person to talk to? Because I think sadly, more often than not, we might actually have some sort of advocate or somebody who would be supportive around us, but we actually don't know. And like Jordan said, why would somebody want to risk, especially somebody who has already lost so much? So I think each of us thinking about what that could look like. I've even given workshops for people to say, well, how can I do that? I don't even have an office. I'm all on Zoom now. I'm like, put a rainbow flag and a trans flag in your background, make sure that you do talk about this, because just as with other issues that impact marginalized communities, some folks can kind of get bored of it, like, oh, this subject, I thought we were over it. But most people don't have the luxury to, for it to be a boring subject to them anymore. So I think knowing that, there are so many people who are undercover, I think it's up to us to also know, are we being an undercover ally? And so to completely take that cover off and make sure that whatever, stage that we're in, that we're always, wear a pin, like really anything, to figure out the ways in which you can be visible. And like you said, Jordan, I mean, I hear from you and others as well, the lament in the lack of supports and recognition. And so I am thankful for the discourse that have, where I can sort of see, that people are starting to take it seriously. And I hope that continues to lead to financial change, because really that's how we're going to create a more sustainable future for folks who are being the most impacted by this. One question that I think is, I would want to pose really quickly, because one of y'all might have a sheet on this or something. Miranda posted here, are there resources specifically geared towards talking about what religious freedom is and is not in a Canadian context? Because I know when we would have conversations, this was brought up often to say, we should be allowed to do what we want to do, and we believe that this helps people. Is there a resource or a place where folks can go to kind of, thread out what that actually looks like or means?
The one kind of thing that popped to mind, I was just Googling it quickly, is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, as they kind of work in terms of promoting the civil or charter rights and whatnot. So I was just quickly on their website, and I can share the page that talks about religious freedom specifically. I'll post it in the chat here. And there are civil liberties associations in all the provinces. Like here in Alberta, we have the Alberta Civil Liberties Association as well, so a research center. So they would have information about those. So I posted that quick one there. It talks a little bit about what religious freedom is. So hopefully that's a little bit more information.
Thank you. That's helpful. Tony, you're asking a question around, a way to sort of send out an affirming statement on conversion therapy, kind of like the UCC apologies have done in the past, that explains the CT ban, the area of criminal code it involves, and who to contact if you have to report it. This might be something that we should be able to say not only goes against legislation, but also church policy polity as an affirming denomination, because it's disturbing that this is happening in the UCC. Absolutely. Why not? I mean, I think that that's something that we could definitely support happening. And, similarly to there being designations around affirming and different other things, like being green or other commitments that we make. I think that this is definitely worthy of that. So are there, that gives me something to think about, but I'm wondering from our panelists, if there's something around that we could kind of share publicly or something that we can commit to on behalf of our organization, or to kind of stir up some change and conversation. What other, things could we sort of look at for guidance on that?
I really appreciate this conversation, and just sort of listening to Jordan and you, Pam, and others who have weighed in with really excellent reflections and questions. I mean, I just want to say that I think groups like Affirming Connections, other affirming churches, so important. I mean, I can't imagine what my life would have been like if I had even an idea, a concept of an affirming faith environment, just because I was in a sea of darkness, and every person that I could think of that had a significant role in my faith-based community was not someone that I felt I could turn to for support. My parents, my family ratted me out to our pastor, and made this sort of referral to this ex-gay Christian therapist. From that moment on, I felt like my fate was sealed. And I think this conversation about, I love that acronym PIE, public, intentional, and explicit. That is so important, and we've all spoken to different ways in which the work is still ongoing. We've still got a long way to go. It's going to take a long time for things like the new law to have an effect in terms of the lived realities that queer and trans people are in right now. Again, I think this is one of the critiques of the push behind the ban is, that it doesn't do much for people that are in it right now. And so I think this conversation is so important, because how do we go from here? How can groups like Affirming Connections, those that are embedded in more affirming churches and faith-based communities, there's so much that can be done at an individual and a structural level. And I think, I just want to thank you, Pam, for organizing this panel and including us in this conversation, because, as important as the new law is, it's just one piece of a much bigger, complicated, messy puzzle. And there's so much more that we can all do as individuals, as members of affirming, supportive organizations and groups. So thanks.
Thank you.
I would add that it's important for religious organizations to study, to offer studies and resources on religious trauma. and what are the mechanisms that cause damage. So you can identify if it's happening in your faith community or not. So you can also support a person who is coming out of that kind of faith community, if you're an affirming faith community. Yeah, the religious freedom is a huge thing. I don't know the answers to that one, but it really needs to be addressed. I know that we're hoping in some of our work at CVRC to bring together folks from across sectors to have this kind of conversation, to continue the conversations that we're having tonight. So yeah, I would just say, please feel free to reach out to me through CVRC at any time.
Thank you for that. Jessica.
I want to kind of tag on to something Michael said. You said, you know, this is the law is one aspect in this big complicated situation, and I agree. And you know, the law is kind of where my focus is, so I'm going to kind of zone in on that for a second and say one of the things that, you know, we have done with funding from Justice Canada is really tried to bring awareness of the law specifically. Now, I recognize that we need people, right? The law is kind of divorced from the people, so really those social connections are really important. But one of our objectives over the last 6 months has really been to showcase what the law says. And so people know this is now part of the criminal code. Here are the 4 criminal offenses. Here are the consequences for committing any of these crimes. And so we have created a series of resources around that. And I think Pam has a slide that we put together to just kind of showcase that. So also piggybacking on one of the questions, I think there was Tony's question about, you know, something that explains the ban. You're free to use our resources. We have a few, so we've developed a poster that's available in French and English. It's an 11 by 17 full color poster. This all information is available on our website for free. So if you want to download it, save it, print it, do whatever you can. If you want copies of the poster, we can also mail them to you. So we also, we have a little store, which is free. So it's a store nonetheless. So if you want posters to put up somewhere, we can send them to you. So we have the poster that kind of outlines the ban and the criminal offenses. We have an info sheet also available in French and English, and it's just 2-sided sheets describing the ban and the different offenses. It goes into the definition that's in the legislation a little bit more as well, and then some of the definitions of the terms in the definition. Definitions of some of the terms in the definition. We also, we hosted a webinar a few months ago, talking kind of about again, more the law side of it. So that's available on our YouTube channel. And we're also in the process of putting together a short animated video because we know that people learn in different ways. And so if you are, you know, working with anyone or want to know someone who's would receive that information by video, then that's available as well. And I also want to give a little shout out to Pam because she wrote a piece for us for our lawnow.org website, which is our kind of collection of articles relating law to life. And Pam shared her experience about what the conversion therapy ban means to her. And we had a few others that had shared from different perspectives about that as well. So anyways, I just want to say we have resources available. They're free to use, and so if you want to use those, again, it just talks about the law, but please access them. And our website, I think Pam or Miranda had put it up earlier, cplea.ca. You can find everything there, or if you go cplea.ca/criminal, and you'll find it all there.
Thank you so much, folks. We are at the end of our time here, but not at the end of the work that we're all going to do to continue to support survivors and do harm reduction and prevention. And, you know, I'm trying to remember all the progress that has been made and all the folks that have come long before us to get us to the point where we're at now. Thank you so much to you 3 for coming and sharing your expertise and your own lived experiences. It is hugely important for us to see faces and see folks who are involved in this movement and to know why this matters to you and why it should matter to us. Miranda is going to share or has already shared some resources. If you or someone you know has experienced CT or SOGIECE and want support, there are some supports available. and some groups available where you could, be involved even in an online community. So please avail yourself of those. And as Jordan said, you can contact Jordan and Michael, those great folks. You can contact us. We have resources on our website too, on affirmingconnections.com, that talk about we should be able to live in the fullness of who we are, in all pieces of ourselves without having to fracture anything of the beauty of how we've been made. So thank you so much, folks. Appreciate you. And I'm glad that we're in this together.